My name is Michael Zank. I'm the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second panel this morning. Our moderator will be Professor Abigail Gillman, professor of German, Hebrew, and Jewish Studies. And she's also the one who developed the concept and put together the programs for today. So I would like you to give a warm welcome to Professor Gillman.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. So we are moving on to our second panel, and the topic of this panel is Professor Wiesel's Learning and Teaching in Faith, Jewish and Christian Theology After the Holocaust. Our first speaker is Sharon Portnoff, who is the Elie Wiesel Professor of Jewish Studies at Connecticut College. Take it away, Sharon.
All right, so I've been asked to say a couple of words, first of all, about the Akedah, chapter 22 of Genesis, because in one way or another, all of us are going to be saying a few words about it. So for those people who are not familiar with it, the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac, is among the most powerful stories in the Bible. In just 19 verses, it tells the story of God commanding the patriarch Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac, and Abraham binding his son, taking the fire and the knife, and almost following through. Should one, we might ask, obey the command of a God who seems to operate outside the norms of moral behavior? How does such action affect our world? For Wiesel, as it was for the rabbis through the centuries, the Akedah becomes one means of making meaning from catastrophe. But I want to start with a story about the first time I met Wiesel, though he would hardly remember it. And now I think how foolish I was not to have asked him when I was his student, if he did. I was quite young at the time, a teenager perhaps, and he had come to Philadelphia where I lived to speak. I had been reading his 1976 essay, The Sacrifice of Isaac, a Survivor's Story, and had been talking to my mother about it, so she suggested we go to hear him. I must admit I don't remember much of his lecture, though as I'm sure all of us who were fortunate enough to have learned from him in person would know, I felt myself on a different plane, somehow lifted up, strangely reflective. I was, at the same time, slightly in awe of this famous and important man. After he spoke, my mother and I were walking off together through the crowd to exit the building when suddenly, frighteningly, I found myself face to face with him. He waited. It seemed he sensed there was something to say, and I said, and I remember these are my exact words, and I said, "Thank you for your midrash on Isaac. It helped me." Another moment, then he was gone. It was a great gift I felt at the time, that moment. Similarly, in reading the essay recently, I note that Wiesel makes a moment, as it were. Something is communicated that is neither in the words nor simply accessible to reason. Instead, he reflects on various midrashim, a form of rabbinic commentary through which, as Wiesel writes, internal conflicts become tangible. Various forms of midrashim on the Akedah, the binding, or as he calls it, tellingly, the sacrifice of Isaac. We learn that both God and Abraham are compromised, that God is ashamed that he has pushed things too far, that God wants man to approach him through love and challenge, not simple obedience. Most pointedly to me, Wiesel writes first that for the Jew, all truth must spring from life, never from death. And second, that he has always felt much closer to Isaac, who, he writes, becomes a poet, than to his father, Abraham. Note, however, that Wiesel does not write that he feels a connection only with Isaac, only that this connection is stronger than the one he feels with Abraham. We recall, too, that Wiesel was a child in Auschwitz, a child who watched his father die. It is in these two things, the springing of all truth from life, and the vocation of a poet, that I find the deepest meaning of Wiesel's reflections on the Akedah, and by extension, the Holocaust. The essay is a lesson in hope, a particularly Jewish hope, a hope that borders on despair, that springs from life, which, as one midrash teaches us, includes the doubt that Abraham had to have in order to remain human. Wiesel feels close to Isaac because Isaac personifies his hope in his living after the almost sacrifice. He has a family. He raises children. He becomes a poet, the author of the Mincha service. And he has earned the right to challenge God and to defend his people. Likewise, Wiesel, as it were, becomes a poet, raising questions, not to lament his suffering, but to defend his people. But if Isaac learns from the sacrifice that all truth springs from life, how can he, given his experience, hope without its being fantasy, delusion? Life teaches him that he is the innocent victim, the collateral damage, as it were, of the total commitment of his father to God's calling. His response is to remind God of the priority of living and to write a poem that, as it were, creates his hope and his challenge, that we may one day come to know that all truth springs from life. Given the turn that life has taken in our world and time, Wiesel suggests that, quote, the question is no longer whether Isaac was saved, but whether the miracle could happen again, and how often, and for what reasons, and at what cost. And here we get to the richness of the moment that Wiesel invites his readers to form in his reflection on the Midrashim that in the past have answered to the deepest needs of Jews in various moments of their history. The reflection that invites us to create from the world he writes. We continue to live, we continue to hope, we tell stories, we laugh, and we remember the catastrophe.
Thank you. I was so eager to get started that I didn't mention in my introduction that when we started to plan a panel that was about theology after the Holocaust, that we decided that the focus would be Professor Wiesel's teachings about the Akedah, about the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22, and specifically that his relationship to that story in this book, Messengers of God. The chapter is called The Sacrifice of Isaac, a Survivor's Story. Sharon gave us some quotes from that, from this chapter. And, but probably, how many of you have heard a lecture about Isaac? Right, so this was a character in a story that he lectured on often, that he came back to, I think even in 2012, was back to Isaac, why I love Isaac. Isaac was certainly someone that he loved and thought about and identified with. So that is the focal point. I encourage all of you to go back to this essay, which is really incredible. And our next speaker is Mary C. Boyes. Mary, it's such an honor to have you here today. Mary is a vice president and a dean at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And you hold the Skinner and McAlpin Chair in Practical Theology. And we need a theologian in this knot. So, Mary, thank you.
Thank you, Abby. The privilege is all mine. Shortly after I moved to New York City in 1974 to go to graduate school, I saw an advertisement in the New York Times for Elie Wiesel's lectures at the 92nd Street Y. I don't know how I then knew of Wiesel, but I do recall that I was determined to go to those lectures. So I took the New York City phone book, remember phone books? And I looked for the 92nd Street Y, and I couldn't find one until it dawned on me that I was looking at the YMCAs. Because where I come from, we didn't have the YMHA. Well, I did attend those lectures, which I believe were early drafts of some of the chapters in Messengers of God. And unlike many of you privileged to study with Professor Wiesel here at Boston University or at other institutions where he taught, I never studied formally with him. But he was my teacher in the freedom and anguish with which he questioned God. Of course, Wiesel has not been my only Jewish teacher, nor even really, I would say, the most important one. But there is a paragraph in The Sacrifice of Isaac that speaks directly to a topic that has preoccupied me for many years. Wiesel writes, "At the top of Moriah, the living remains alive, thus marking the end of ritual murder. To invoke the Akedah is tantamount to calling for mercy. Whereas from the beginning, Golgotha has served as a pretext for countless massacres of sons and fathers, cut down together by sword and fire in the name of a word that considered itself synonymous with love." To read Wiesel as a Christian, and more particularly as a Catholic, is to confront the question of what those countless massacres, done in the name of the one crucified on the hill of Golgotha, mean for the integrity of the Christian tradition, as well as for one's own faith. Wiesel, simply put, is disturbing. He implicitly asks Christians to face disturbing truths about our tradition. Consider, for example, the story that Wiesel writes in A Jew Today, published in 1978, about his meeting with the eminent French writer Francois Mauriac in 1954, when Wiesel was 27 and hoping to get Mauriac's help in publishing Night. He viewed Mauriac, and here I quote, as famous, old, Mauriac was 70 at the time, and rich, covered with honors, comfortably ensconced in his Catholic faith. In contrast, he saw himself as young, poor, riddled with doubts, a solitary, stateless person, unknown and Jewish. Seeking to put his younger interviewer at ease, Mauriac spoke of his admiration for the Jewish people. He continued by speaking at length about Jesus, the Jew from Nazareth. But in Wiesel's view, it was an impassioned, fascinating monologue on a single theme, the Son of Man, the Son of God, who, unable to save Israel, ended up saving mankind. Every reference led back to him, said Wiesel. Both fascinated and angered, Wiesel spoke sharply to Mauriac. "Sir, you speak of Christ. Christians love to speak of him. The passion of Christ, the agony of Christ, the death of Christ. In your religion, that's all you speak of. Well, I want you to know that 10 years ago, not very far from here, I knew Jewish children, every one of whom suffered 1,000 times more, 6 million times more than Christ on the cross. And we don't speak about them. Can you understand that, sir? We don't speak about them." Wiesel, of course, went on to speak about those Jewish children, becoming one of the most renowned witnesses of the Shoah. And still, I hear him asking, how are you speaking of the Christ, of the death of Christ? Because how we Christians speak of Christ, particularly about his crucifixion, is at the heart of how we Jews and Christians relate to one another. And if we are to speak about Jesus Christ with integrity, we must take responsibility for what our preaching and teaching mean and meant for Jews. To put this as straightforwardly as possible, our sacred texts have been used in sacrilegious ways. More specifically, the Passion narratives in the 4 canonical Gospels of the New Testament have been interpreted in ways that have justified, inspired, and sustained hostility to and violence against Jews as Christ killers. Our texts became raw materials for hostility to Jews. And one need never have picked up a New Testament to know the basic contours of the story of the crucifixion of Jesus and the events leading up to it. Yet, however well known the fundamental contours of this story, Christians have a serious case of amnesia when it comes to awareness of and sensitivity to what Jews have endured over the millennia because of how our tradition told its sacred story. We too, as Christians, are obliged to honor the commandment, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." And yet Christians have used our texts to bear false witness against Jews, often because we assumed the texts were in essence factual. In our time, however, we have the resources to read ancient texts in new ways, and we have the ethical obligation now to do so. This is not a matter of rewriting texts, but of rereading and reinterpreting them, developing new midrashim, as it were, probing how we might situate the crucifixion in its historical matrix as state-sponsored terrorism of the Roman Empire. And here I might mention another of my Jewish teachers, not in a formal way, but that is Paula Fredrickson, who was a professor of New Testament here. And her work on the Passion has been outstanding. Reinterpreting our sacred texts implies a cold, hard look at history and the willingness to be affected by the wounds Christianity has inflicted, including its complicity in the Holocaust. Well, let me draw this to a conclusion by returning to that 1954 meeting between Wiesel and Mauriac. Wiesel was taken aback by the audacity of what he said to the revered Mauriac, and he left quickly. But while waiting for the elevator, he felt a hand on his arm. It was Mauriac asking him to return. So he did, Wiesel writes. And suddenly, the man I had just defended began to cry. Wordlessly, never taking his eyes off me, he wept and wept. Mauriac wanted no apologies. To the contrary, he wanted to know why Wiesel hadn't written. In 1978, Wiesel testified, "I shall never forget that first meeting. Others followed, but that one left its mark on me. It was brought to a close by Mauriac's escorting me to the door. There, after embracing me, he assumed a grave, solemn mien. 'I think that you were wrong not to speak. Listen to the old man that I am. One must speak out. One must also speak. I, for one, am profoundly grateful that Wiesel has spoken out with such learning, passion, and eloquence. And as a Catholic theologian, I thank God that he has disturbed me.'"
Our next speaker is Jonathan Rosen. Jonathan Rosen is the author of 4 books. He is an essayist, a journalist, and an editor. And also you mentioned that you had, as editor of the next book series of these wonderful Schocken biographies, that you worked with Elie Wiesel editing his book on Rashi. And it's a real honor to have you, Jonathan. Thank you for coming.
Can people hear me? No mic is ever so loud that people can hear me, but if you can, that's great. Thanks so much, Abby. I want to begin by saying how moved and honored I am to be part of an event devoted to the life of Elie Wiesel, especially at Boston University, where my father taught German literature in the early 1970s. Wow. My father's father was murdered in Buchenwald, and because that is where night ends, and I read night as a boy, I think I always associated the two figures somehow, except that my dead grandfather preceded the living Wiesel, which was strange, a blurring of the private and the public, as well as a blurring of murder and survival. These complexities and confusions found an echo in my encounters with Wiesel's work and later with Wiesel himself. I was never sure if night was about the survival of Elie Wiesel or about the death of the Jewish people, or about the survival of the Jewish people but the death of God, or about the survival of God but the death of Elie Wiesel, who at the end of night is a corpse. But since he is a corpse who looks at himself in the mirror, he isn't really a corpse, just as God hanging on the gallows in the body of a little boy isn't really God. Anyway, I'm very grateful to have a chance to think about Wiesel and the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, which is really a chance to think about fathers and sons. And I used to think Wiesel was Isaac, abandoned on the altar by a father who cared more about God's promise than his son's life, or who mistook the voice of custom and authority for the voice of God until it was too late. Rereading Night, I suddenly thought perhaps young Elie is Abraham. He seems to be the only pious person in Siget before the deportation. He weeps every night over the destruction of Jerusalem, craving divine answers, although his father tells him he is too young for Kabbalistic secrets. If Elie is Abraham, then his father is Terach, Abraham's father, worshiping idols like the rest of the community. Idols of complacency, idols of optimism, of business as usual, of faith in everyday life, of faith that history is on their side, faith that the Russian army will save them without their having to fight or flee, faith that Christian civilization has evolved beyond old animosities and will keep them safe. When Elie urges his father to sell everything, to get up and go to Palestine, his father says, "I'm too old," because Jews are either too young or too old. Wiesel would like to smash his father's idols. The Germans smashed them for him, so perhaps he can't be Abraham either. Back to Isaac. Towards the end of night, when the boy wishes to be rid of the burden of his father, and you feel all his smothered rage and self-lacerating devotion, I thought, maybe Isaac has to sacrifice Abraham, an inverted narrative for an upside-down world. No wonder Wiesel put God on the cross, or at least the gallows, and let Francois Mauriac tell him he was Lazarus, a Jew back from the dead, even if that made Mauriac Jesus, recalling Lazarus, Eliezer, to life. It allowed Wiesel to turn 800 pages of unread Yiddish, the first long version of Night, into a New Testament, a complex collaboration that ultimately struck a chord in post-war Europe and America, perhaps because it was an echo of that great post-war American fiction, the Judeo-Christian tradition. I remember how surprised I was discovering that Judeo-Christian was a concept created in response to the anti-Semitism of the 30s, and that it only took hold after the Holocaust as a way of making room for Jews in Christian America and a way of implicating Christian America in its Jewish roots. Judeo-Christian was also a kind of exculpatory blessing for Christianity, because if Christianity was part of the same tradition as Christianity's victims, then the line between aggressor and victim could be blurred, like Reconstruction after the Civil War, necessary for union or reunion, but fraught with ambiguity. But Wiesel and the tradition reject all my suggestions with larger possibilities. As Wiesel points out in his essay on the Akedah, the tradition imagines Satan prompting the whole transaction. The tradition imagines Isaac actually getting killed. Isaac doesn't go away after his death, of course, but still stares out of the mirror of Jewish culture. Isaac is murdered and alive, which is to say resurrected. However occult that strain of thinking may be, Jews daily bless a God who resurrects the dead. So Mauriac's suggestion was present all along. His New Testament was already old inside Judaism. The traditional Akedah, the binding that takes the place of child sacrifice, is the reaction to a story that came before it as well as after. When Wiesel told Mauriac in their first encounter that Jesus on the cross didn't suffer half as much, or 1,000,000 times, or 6,000,000 times as much as the Jewish children he saw burned at Auschwitz. He wasn't denying the pain and terror of the crucifixion. He was saying that for Jews, crucifixion is an everyday matter. But through Mauriac, Wiesel could reclaim a forgotten truth, that Jews aren't the ever-dying people, a phrase often quoted complacently by post-Holocaust all-rightniks. Jews are the ever-resurrected people. Wiesel understood that terrible heretical secret, which Jews hide even from themselves, for fear it will give their life-affirming faith a license for dying. The temple was destroyed and Jews were born again. The rebuilt temple was destroyed and Jews were born again. Israel makes the secret explicit, which is why so many people, including Jews, are so frightened of it. Not because Israel is the New Testament of the Jews, but because it is just one of many Jewish New Testaments, which aren't really New Testaments, but Old New Testaments. Esau, the older sibling who gave up his blessing, is not simply the displaced other, but an aspect of the Jews themselves, alive inside a living Jewish story. Jews were told by Christian culture that they could only be Esau. In reaction, Jews embraced only Jacob, the smooth youth who buys the birthright and steals the blessing. But old new Jacob is also Esau, stealing the birthright from himself. From Christianity, Wiesel reclaimed the resurrected hero, and while he was at it, he took back the birthright of the firstborn son, both figures native to Judaism. With Wiesel, the choice isn't Abraham or Isaac. It isn't the particular or the universal. In his heretically normative way, it is all of the above, which allows a legacy of brokenness to become its opposite. So I want to end with Wiesel's Zionism, which I think is a great thread in his work. Dawn, after all, is set in Palestine. But his vision was not of an exclusive wholeness. In a full-page ad that ran in 2014 in newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, Wiesel invoked the Akedah, calling on Hamas to stop using children as human shields. It said in very large letters at the top of the ad, Jews rejected child sacrifice 3,500 years ago. Now it's Hamas's turn. The ad spoke of Abraham's two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, how both were promised and both became great nations, and how both left child sacrifice behind. It was Hamas, not the Arabs or Islam, that Wiesel was addressing. Still, the Times of London refused to run the ad, claiming that the opinion being expressed is too strong and too forcefully made and will cause concern amongst a significant number of Times readers. Now that is an Old Testament.
Take a breath. So many interesting themes. Jesus. Speechless. So many questions and themes and strains here. The only thing to do is turn to Rabbi Joe Kanofsky. Rabbi Kanofsky flew in this morning from Toronto through the fog, the week before Rosh Hashanah, the morning after Slichot. Thank you so much for coming, Rabbi Kanofsky.
A story. Rabbi Dov Ber chose his disciples very carefully. The hopeful, who were not accepted as his students, remained in the town of Mezerich to absorb what they could of the spiritual atmosphere. They would hang around the house of study and tend to menial chores. Rabbi Shner Zalman was one of those chosen to be a disciple, and he recalled a conversation he overheard one evening among the sweepers and the stokers. One of the stokers said to another, "Why was the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, so special? If God revealed himself to me, and commanded me to sacrifice my son, wouldn't I do as he asked? He answered his own question, if God asked me, I would surely have done it. But I would have waited a few days to have a little more time with my son. Abraham was great in that he got up early in the morning to fulfill God's command without delay. The second stoker said in response, if God asked me, I would have done just as Abraham, awaken early the next morning. But I would have been sad. I would feel regret. Abraham went to the Akedah with joy to do the will of his Creator. The third says, I would do it with both joy and alacrity, but I could not match Abraham's joy when he found out that it was a test, when the angel said, do not touch the child. Abraham was overjoyed at the chance to do still more. When Rebbe Shner Zalman of Liadi recounted to his students what he had heard, he explained, each of them was telling something about himself, revealing the level of self-sacrifice that he had achieved in his divine service. The Akedah, chapter 22 of Genesis, the binding of Isaac, is uniquely a Jewish story. Of course, it is also a uniquely Christian story. How could it not be? This first tale of a father willing to sacrifice his son, his only son whom he loves. And it's a uniquely Muslim story too. Although there is dispute among Muslim commentators as to whether it was Isaac or Ishmael who was the near sacrifice, nevertheless, the story is revisited, relived every year on Eid al-Adha. The story of the Akedah challenges us as it challenged Kierkegaard. It tests us as it tested Abraham, even as it lifts us up. The word to test is nisa. The beginning of the story says, V'Elokim nisa es Avraham. God tested Abraham, as we would usually translate it. And it resonates with Psalm 60, where the word nes also appears. Nasata lereyecha nes lehisnoses. You have given a banner to your loyal followers for them to raise up. Challenges which also lift us up to a higher level are the most meaningful and transformative. We might phrase the challenge of the binding of the Isaac story in these terms. Are we willing only to walk with a God who affirms what we already know to be true, who commands us to do what we already know to be moral and possible and within our grasp? Or can we acknowledge that we only grow and learn and change when we are pushed beyond comfortable limits, to confront beliefs or obligations which are unaccustomed, which make us uncomfortable, challenges that we are not entirely sure at the outset that we measure up to? Every serious theologian, clergy, and layperson ought to entertain this challenge. It applies to teachers and students, masters and disciples too. It's a nes lehisnoses. It's a test and also a banner that we raise and lift ourselves up in the process. The binding of Isaac is the very limit of human possibility. It's the extreme edge. That's why it's the test case. What would you do if confronted with a choice at the very edge of what is imaginable? And what questions come out of the experience? And how does it change us? That's the Akedah's challenge. Let me suggest that the lessons of our teacher invite us to the same theological nes, a test to challenge us and a banner to raise us up. We are all boundlessly grateful for Professor Wiesel's teachings, for his stories, his encouragement, his smiles at us, his laughter, all of which made us what we are. He always wanted us to come together and share friendship and memories of what we had studied together and new insights. And thank you to everyone who organized today so that we could do that. Although to our sorrow, he is not here today in the way that we would most want. And yet, let me suggest that his teachings are very much alive, and that those teachings question us perhaps at the very same depth that the Akedah does. Professor Wiesel's life of witness and moral courage offers us a lift up quite a few levels if we allow it to. He articulates for all of us the most difficult of difficult questions, whether we are of the Abrahamic faiths or a different faith, or no faith at all at the moment. And that is, how can we continue becoming better, truer, deeper, and more authentic iterations of ourselves? That's what the most precious and valuable mentor and guide does. And this is what Professor Wiesel did for me, and why I'm eager to share with so many here today how we have been changed for the experience of having been and continuing to be his students. Professor Wiesel's life took him to the very edge of what is conceivable in human experience. He stood in every sense at the edge of the abyss and peered in. Who knows how, but he was able to come back from the edge and then to write about it with words so powerful that in any language they shatter the heart and daub ashes on the soul. We couldn't have asked for more in a teacher. Now the challenge faces us. Do we remain receptive to it all, or only to what confirms what we think we already know? One letter I received in sympathy last summer from a UCC minister with whom I've enjoyed a friendship for 35 years. I'm still pretty young, so that's a long time for me. The letter recalled how influential Professor Wiesel's writings had been for both of us. And then at the end there was a comment, of course, I and many of my colleagues were disappointed that he didn't take a stronger stand on such and such an issue. For me, this is the heart of the question. When a fountain, a living spring of humanity, as was mentioned before, he was a professor in the humanities, teaching us how to be human. When he teaches me so much about being human, what happens when his view conflicts with what I think I already know? Do I accept from such a master only the values that already resonate in me, or do I push myself to put aside my prejudice, my conclusion, and entertain a new perspective? As Abraham, who broke new ground in answering God's call, in remaining open to that moment, even though it challenged everything he thought he understood. We're all here because of it. As the university student that I once was, and hopefully in some way still am, I left Professor Wiesel's seminar 20 years ago, but I've never left. In my best moments, I aspire to teach as he taught, learn as he learned, and care as he cared. And in my very best moments, to sing as he sang. I try to remain open in moments of spiritual or professional crisis, to recognize in each one a chance to deepen myself, to continue becoming, as he influenced me so profoundly in those 10 years that I had the joy and privilege and merit to take part in his seminar. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, University Professors Program of Blessed Memory. Thank you, Boston University. It's why I have on my bookshelf in my office a picture of Professor Wiesel, looking over my shoulder as I give a class. It's why I recite chapter 22 of Genesis, the story of the binding of Isaac, each morning. It's why I wrote to a group of friends on that sorrowful morning last July, quoting no less a contemporary sage than Oprah herself, who in my view said it perfectly of Professor Wiesel, quote, "Being in his presence, exposed to his wisdom, has been one of the great blessings of my life." Thanks.
Would any of you like to respond, speak, have the last word, maybe one or two?
I'm speechless.
I'm a little speechless too.
The four of us speechless, that might be a miracle.
There you go.
Yes. Stand up. There's a mic. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yasher koach.
Thank you.
Question for the four of you, since we're talking about the.
Louder.
It's not on.
I have a question for the four of you, since we're speaking about Isaac. Well, I'd like to hear,
We can hear it. We'll say it back.
Oh,
to
can you
the
hear me
audience.
now?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I have a question in regard to the binding of Isaac that wasn't brought up, and I think you guys are probably more expert in this. The fact that in Hebrew, the name Isaac means laughter. So how does that, it's something to contemplate when you're thinking about that story. So I wonder if any of you have more thoughts on that.
Yes. This might be a good, I think we really might only have time for one question, and that's a good one, and it actually is the last word of this essay.
Abby, do you mind repeating the
Sure.
question?
I'm about to.
Paraphrase it.
I'm about to. The question is paralleling the closing words of this sentence, which is Professor Wiesel's writing about his signature story for so many reasons, that Isaac remained capable of laughter, and in spite of everything, he did laugh. So the significance of Isaac's name being laughter, this might be a nice place to end. Did you want to say something about that?
I'll say something, which is not in any way a good answer or even an answer. What I'd say is I feel like in the same sense that there are lots of Isaacs and Akedahs in this essay he writes, there are many versions of Wiesel. And so when I reread Night in preparation for being here, I was overwhelmed by re-encountering what for me was a very different Wiesel, even from the one I heard spoken about by people who were teaching Night, because it's often said that Night is the sort of the opposite of the Diary of Anne Frank. One, it's before she has encountered hell and the death camps and her own horrific death. So she still believes in the goodness and universal nature of love and people. And the other is the person on the other side, who is not only dead, but every natural affection and order is overturned. And yet, mysteriously, it is as if he has emerged in a kind of Anne Frank-like way, which I just find fascinating. And the reason why all this is a complicated answer to laughter is because my father, who was born in Vienna and whose father died in Buchenwald, used to say, and it's a very dark, terrible, Kafka-worthy observation, anyone who's laughing hasn't heard the news. At the same time, he loved to laugh.
Yes, he
and
did.
so I feel that for Wiesel, the last word may be laughter, but it is also because somebody is weeping someplace else, and it's just holding those two in your mind.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful answer. With that, we're going to thank these wonderful, wonderful speakers. Thank you.